Okay, where am I? I'm going to start what I want to say about this film in relation to the concept of propaganda, because this film is a propaganda film. It was funded by a government agency, and it was clearly part of the war effort in the early 1940s. And of course, propaganda is a difficult semiotic area because obviously you're not supposed to like it. So I'm going to start with that. I'm going to leave out as much as I can of the story of the film in the expectation that you've seen most of it, and then talk a bit about what really interests me about Humphrey Jennings now, and that is to see him as a very early example, but by no means the only one, not an unusual one, of someone with great artistic and technical expertise using that capability to produce something that you might even regard as a co-created, consumer-led content piece of work. And that's what I think Silent Village is. It was made by the people in it for their own purposes, as much as it was by Humphrey Jennings for his, and as much as it was by the government agency for theirs. So it's a way of bringing together the themes that I mentioned in my last talk. So let's start with propaganda and say that the default definition of propaganda, in English anyway, bears all the traces of political history going back to the Reformation and the French Revolution. In other words, propaganda is understood as having to do with foreign religion and foreign ideology, and it's based on a hatred of A, the Catholics, and B, the French. So these quotations from the OED talk about the original source of the word, which is the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, the organization in Rome that was the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. And as you see there, this is an 1842 definition that says that the term propaganda is applied in modern political language as a term of reproach to secret associations for the spread of opinions and principles which were viewed by most governments with horror and aversion. A great definition. And then later on, this fantastically anti-French definition: we have ever been disposed to attribute the wonderful success of the French since their revolutionary era to propagandism, or in other words, to the poison of their principles circulated by their emissaries in corrupting the mind of the nations they propose to attack. So this is where we start with on propaganda. So since the very idea of propaganda is to subvert a given country's religion, its government, or even its mind, and to put that nation in jeopardy of attack, it would seem to follow that the best propaganda is that which succeeds in producing, from the point of view of the home nation, or the attacked nation as it were, the worst possible outcomes. Recommending, therefore, that any particular example of propaganda is a great work of art, or the best of its genre, of such a weapon, is surely perverse, or possibly even worse. It's tantamount to trying to name, the best terrorist outrage, or the best suicide bombing. It's in provocative taste, provocative bad taste, that is, or as Ali G might have put it, propaganda appears to strike at the heart of a basic proposition of Western-style democracies. Political theory requires that the sovereign citizen voter is the source, not the destination of both political legitimacy and government actions. So nothing is more important to democracy than that the citizen is informed. Michael Schudson has argued that in the USA, the conception of the citizen has evolved since the early days of the Republic, from a democracy of trust, in prominent families that is, via a democracy of partisanship with the ascendancy of political parties, to a democracy of information in the late 19th century, and finally and currently to a democracy of rights. This is Michael Schudson. He says that the information democracy was established between 1880 and 1910 and featured the elevation of the individual, educated, rational voter as the model citizen. He says politics came to be organized and narrated in a way more accessible to rational reflection. Presidents made promises, crafted programs, offered comprehensive federal budgets, and championed policies. Newspapers covered politics with a degree of dispassion. Judson points out, however, that just this rational model of citizenship gained ground at the turn of the 20th century, emphasizing the exercise of individual choice. So individual participation in voting drastically fell. It was the earlier carnivalesque ritual of expressing public loyalty to a partisan cause that actually brought voters to the ballot box, rather than the private calculus of rational information. And so, perversely, the elevation of the informed citizen produced an equal but opposite need for new devices to persuade voters to vote at all. In short, reason and emotion learned to coexist, not least in the form of spectacular party conventions and presidential campaigns, which of course we're all enjoying. Thank you for the show. Political campaigning using propaganda techniques therefore became an internal necessity for democracies, while foreign propaganda remained an external threat. The horror and aversion of those who were at the receiving end of propaganda soon turned to imitation and reciprocation. Propaganda necessarily became indigenized. Thenceforth, a distinction had to be made between our propaganda and theirs. One goal of our propaganda in times of emergency has been to drum up enmity, not rational calculus, to the point where citizens would be willing to kill for their country, a fear that requires carefully concerted propaganda, such as war movies, to overcome self-restraint and to legitimize what Norbert Elias calls the joy of killing and destruction that have been repressed from everyday civilized life. That's the role of the war movie in the Second World War, for example, from Hollywood. Meanwhile, in everyday civilized life, where people are repressing the joy of killing mostly, what may be called informed consumption prospered as well. So we have the informed consumer as well as the informed citizen. Consumers needed to be persuaded to choose wisely, just as citizens did too. Soon the term propaganda began to be applied to commercial as well as political campaigns, although the word propaganda, as opposed to the practice of it, remains stigmatized, especially in the USA. So the dictionary again shows us this. The term propaganda has not the sinister meaning in Europe that it has acquired in America. In European business offices, the word means advertising or boosting. And when a certain practical activity is stimulated as expedient, that which stimulates it is advertisement, or in the current modern sense, propaganda. So expert elites in politics and commerce became skilled in propaganda techniques while seeking to persuade their own citizen consumers to resist propaganda from disapproved sources. A fundamental contradiction entered the life of commercial democracies. Consumers and voters must be influenced by persuasive campaigns to buy this or vote for that or go to war, whereas the notion of the informed citizen requires that they must not submit to or succumb to propaganda, especially foreign propaganda. The contradiction is resolved at the point of reception, that is, inside the brain of the citizen, because popular culture is thoroughly suffused with propaganda, which soon became part of the everyday fabric of modernity. As the familiar cliche about the media has it, citizen consumers are constantly bombarded, as if by the French, with advertising, PR, spin, party political publicity, and all the rest. The skills of everyday life, then, soon included navigating such stuff, much as everyone has to learn how to navigate crowded streets, where some attempts to attract one's attention would be far from welcome, while others are part of the pleasure of being out in public. Propaganda was not a national matter, but something that the general population had to deal with personally every day. Just as most people pick up the skills required to get by unmolested in the city, even though that risk is always there, so they soon learn how to avoid commercial democracies' many blandishments. And since familiarity does indeed breed contempt, propaganda could not escape it either. Naturally then, a propensity to aversion among the target population built up. People avoided propaganda. There's lots of evidence for that. And this spurs the experts and professionals to greater efforts in their attempts to get the blasé consumer to make eye contact with the intended delights of the particular propaganda message. Propagandists learnt the tricks of popular entertainment, including the use of mass psychology and marketing. Over time, the semiotic intensity of modern life became self-generating. People expected more from those who presumed to address them. Audiences and consumers took their reading competence and their avoidance strategies with them from street to screen, and propaganda followed them indoors. Politics is not only a matter of rational calculation, but also a source of affiliative passions and an object of personal desire. Some propaganda was able to hit the emotional, aesthetic, or spectacular mark. Advertising professionals, psychological experts, and visual artists occasionally excelled themselves, producing work that long outlived its instrumental purpose. It could be thrilling at the time and actually provoke those actions desired by the propagandist. Later, it might achieve timeless status. For instance, inaugurating the Age of You, direct address to the citizen in order to provoke individual action, was Alfred Leet's Your Country Needs You and James Flagg's Uncle Sam version, which of course everybody knows. So, propaganda was visibly present in the form of commercials and sponsorship in the mass media, but its technique also pervaded modernity's two great realisms, that is, drama and journalism. It turned up in and as movies and news. This is not to say that propagandists deliberately subverted the purpose of the information media, although that certainly does happen from time to time. The point is almost the opposite, that propaganda and its techniques used to reveal the real were the same. The propaganda and its techniques and the techniques used to reveal the real were the same. Both propaganda and news turned social or political problems into conflict narratives. Both traded in negatives. Both cast ordinary people as victims. Both used eyewitness techniques and documentary reportage to establish authenticity. Both used expert commentary, the omniscient male voiceover, for example, to invoke preferred solutions. Both resolved the plot by showing happy or grateful citizens, or, where the plot was not resolved, by showing their ongoing misery as a call to action. Where they differed, this is drama and news, is in the attribution of agency to the solution. News reported on the agency of expert institutions that acted on behalf of citizen viewers. It sought narrative transparency, following the realist aesthetic, where truth can be seen to arise from facts, evidence, and the properties of the real, as observed and reported by accurate techniques. But propaganda was not a spectacle about the drama of the real, it was a call to arms. The agency required to solve problems was not a representative body, but you. Propaganda is much less respectful of current realities than is realism, because it's primarily interested in changing them and in what may become true in the future. It can therefore be much more open about how it seeks to achieve its effects, including the fact that it intends to leave those effects upon you, the viewer. So propaganda differs from realism in this crucial respect, that it positions the audience quite differently from realism. Realism and propaganda have been kept separate in Western political rhetoric in order to preserve the idea of the informed citizen, but there was no such need to distinguish propaganda from art. The old masters were propagandists for their patrons, both religious and political, like Michelangelo for successive popes and Vasari for the Medicis, name your artist. Two of the most admired modern oil paintings were conceived and received as anti-war propaganda, that is, Goya's 3rd of May 1808, which you see, and Picasso's Guernica, which you don't. Robert Hughes has written about Goya's great propaganda pieces, of which this is one. He says, the content of Goya's utterance, the perception that war is a despicable and monstrous injustice, an impartial machine that kills men like cattle and most of the time leaves no residue of glory behind it, is the prototype of all modern views of war. What the common people of Europe discovered in their millions in the 20th century, Goya foreshadowed and gave monumental form to in the 3rd of May. Hughes claims that this propaganda artwork is the prototype of all modern views of war, the focus on common people rather than leaders, on suffering and death rather than glory, on faceless mechanized militarism against human values, on documenting events rather than portraying idealized dynasts. He compares the key figure in the painting, I should show you the painting, shouldn't I? He compares the key figure in the painting not with art, but with contemporary journalism. He says, Goya's stocky little martyr of the people is one of those one of the most vivid human presences in all art. He is a 200-year-old equivalent of the few photos that leaked out of Vietnam into long emblematic life. The screaming naked girl, blah, 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 and the chinless police chief blowing out the brains of the plaid-shirted suspect at point-blank range, blah, blah, blah. So, maybe I'll stay there. The most famous prototypes of propaganda in cinema are, for example, Sergei Eisenstein's 1925 battleship Potemkin and Leni and Riefenstahl and Walter Ruttmann's 1934 Triumph of the Will. One of them is a good film and the other is not, in my view. Both attempted to show the energy and power, to say nothing of the inevitability, of modernization from below, as it were, the replacement of old order with a dream of proletarian supremacy, socialism, National Socialism, respectively, before the ideal turned into totalitarian nightmare on both sides. Their reputation rests on their status as cinema, on artistic grounds, rather than on their reception by audiences. They are emptied of the very meanings for the communication of which they were originally commissioned. So, why, given this crowded field, is Humphrey Jennings's The Silent Village the best propaganda artwork of all, which is what I say it is? I think we'll just stay there for a while, if that's all right with you. Or perhaps you can come on to me. Is that possible? Yes. There we are. Hello, that's me. I've turned to Silent Village. The village in question was the mining community of Lidice in the Czech Republic. In 1942, it was in the occupied German protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, whose governor or Reichsprotector was SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, otherwise known as the Butcher of Prague or Der Henker, the hangman. Heydrich was one of the architects of the Holocaust, chairing the 1942 Wannsee Final Solution Conference in Berlin that laid the plans for the extermination of European Jews. He was assassinated in Prague by RAF-assisted Czech partisans, dying on June the 4th, 1942. Nazi reprisals included the murder of over 1,300 Czechs and the destruction of two villages, Lidice on June the 10th. Out of a total population of 500, 340 died. The entire male population of 173 men were shot. The women and children were deported. Estimates suggest that 143 women survived the war and 85 died. 17 children survived the war and 82 died. The village was razed. It was rebuilt after the war. Ležáky, 32 or 33 men were shot. 11 women and children deported. 2 infants survived the war. Ležáky was razed and has not been rebuilt. Leave it there. The destruction of Lidice was reported in Britain, causing a great stir. A Czech poet and diplomat called Viktor Fischl, later known as Dagan Avigdor, exiled in London with the Czech government, interested Humphrey Jennings of the Crown Film Unit in the idea of making a film about the atrocity. Jennings scouted South Wales, a mountainous mining area comparable to the Czech landscape, for suitable locations. He found the small village of Cumgív near Ustalavira in the upper Swansea Valley, under the glowering bulk of Mynydd, the Black Mountain. Jennings virtually took it over for a period of months. He lived there giving lectures at the local Miners' Institute, making notes towards his later book Pandemonium, and coaching the population of Cumgív to take a collective role of the people of Lidice by playing themselves in his film. The Silent Village is an early version of a reenactment documentary. It depicts the events of Lidice by having the villagers of Cumgív reenact them. But at the same time, it is also a straightforward documentary, since the people, the life they live, and the issues they deal with all belong to Cumgív itself and to the South Wales mining community in time of war. In this respect, it's also an early version of reality programming. Like Big Brother, it puts ordinary people in a difficult situation and lets us observe their humanity as they cope with it, except, of course, that Big Brother in this case was the real one, not Humphrey Jennings, but a totalitarian state. Silent Village is in 2 parts, showing life before the coming of the Nazis, which is the bit I think you've seen, and then what happens afterwards. We're introduced to the people by seeing what they do through a working day. There's a fair bit of talk, and it's all in Welsh, without subtitles, augmented by the singing that we heard at the beginning from the chapel. Jennings quietly introduces us to almost everything he needs to tell us the story of Liddicy. In the second half, after the first half is complete, we are to see all the same scenes and people again, but with a deepening sense of horror. Between them, Jennings and the villagers have created a socialist utopian vision of a strong community, united in language and purpose, in its associations, the Fed, the chapel, the school and the shop, and in the rhythms of family and neighbourly life, played out under the shadow of both nature and industry, season and siren. Jennings makes the vision arise from the villagers. This is a film about Wales, imagined as fully as possible in its own terms, in order to stand convincingly for Czechoslovakia. We can only feel the terror of Liddicy's destruction if we're convinced by the values of Cwm Gwydd and begin at once to care for its way of life. Meanwhile, Jennings has introduced the cinema goers of the world to a neglected part of Britain, using the vehicle of government-sponsored propaganda to tell the story of the industrial working class from the inside. He allows no external reference to intrude into this vision. There are no celebrity actors, no imposition of a shaping authorial voice, which is a bad habit of Griersonian British documentary films from Night Train onwards. No reference to the British government, with whom both Jennings and the villagers would have had their differences despite the war effort, nor even the war itself that the villagers, the crew and the audiences alike knew was on to the death. So, an intertitle signals a shift to the second part of the film. Such is life at Cwm Gwydd, and such too was life in Liddicy until the coming of the Nazis. How does Jennings use his slender resources to reenact the invasion of a country, subjugation of a people, and then tell the true story of how a brutal governor is assassinated, leading to the reprisals at the end? This is surely too much to ask of an amateur cast, too expensive to achieve on the budget of a documentary. This is probably not the moment, but I will mention that the film was, the story was made into a proper Hollywood film by Douglas Sirk a little bit later, a film called Hitler's Madman, which you may be able to get hold of over there. And it's certainly a very different way of doing this story from Jennings's. Aided by his surrealist sensibility, Jennings is more than a match for this challenge. Militarism, Nazism and the occupation are reduced to their essence in a few simple symbols. A gleaming official car, always blaring military music or a German accented voice, but whose occupants are never seen, stands for German militarism. It is in fact a very English SS Jaguar, but it looks suitably alien in rural Cwm Gwydd, and there's gallows humour in its name, SS. On the roof is mounted an enormous loudspeaker to stand for the alien language of the aggressor, the techniques of totalitarianism, and to convey the orders of the invader. Domestic radios carry the propaganda of the occupying force into the homes that we've come to know. Beyond a few glimpses of uniformed guards in later action scenes, we never see the enemy. This shows Nazism as dehumanized and mechanistic, and foregrounds that the war itself is being fought for something, not against something. In short, Jennings solved production constraints in a way that enhanced rather than limited the imaginative force of his film. I don't know what I've got next. I'll leave that up for a minute. Jennings draws us into the story of Liddicy by stages, asking his village cast only to do what would have been within their everyday repertoire, like giving their names, for example. I think my slides are out of order from my presentation. If you're interested, this is Cwm Gwydd as it looks like now. This is the chapel is the sandstone-looking building, the rendered building that you can see, and the wall in front of it is the wall against which the miners were shown to be shot in the film. So that's the climactic scene of Silent Village in a photograph from 1990, taken for a documentary show by Prague Television. Okay. In the second half, as I said, the everyday life of the villagers is revisited with a growing sense of horror. The Jag returns several times to threaten enemies of the state with destruction. For example, at the school, the teacher announces in English that and this is the first time we've heard that an order has been received that there is to be no more Welsh spoken in the school. This is a breathtaking bit of displacement, by the way, for as every Welsh viewer would have known, it was the English government that suppressed the speaking of Welsh in schools in the 19th century, using a punishment known as the Welsh Not to discourage its use. For those among the audience who don't know that history, the brutal gesture of conquest is nevertheless clear. For those who do, the pain of such an order is already felt. The teacher makes the children promise to speak Welsh at home, on the roadside and at play. Do not forget your Welsh. The villagers line up to be registered. It is done with dramatic tension and narrative economy. Each one comes to a desk. We see so much in each person's face, expression, stance and garb. It's a typical documentary look. Here is a true portrait then of what is valuable about individuals, no matter what their station. It's already an elegy of a lost community. Each person gives their name, age and occupation as they go past the desk. And one presumes that these are the real names of real people, their real ages and their real occupations. A radio inside one of the houses continues the roll call of villagers, but these people have been sentenced to death by shooting, as the radio puts it. Apparently they had publicly approved of the attempt on Heydrich. The radio voice intones their names, all surnamed Davis. Someone listening to the radio protests. She only just laughed at them. A capital offence, a whole family wiped out. Now the loudspeaker on the car is merciless. I'll get there. The village has aided and abetted the assassins and should produce them by midnight. We see again the people, the stream, the trees, and a clock ticking over. The sky shows dawn. The Welsh national anthem, My Hen Wlad Fy Nadau, fades up on the soundtrack. We see the chapel wall, the menfolk are discovered singing the anthem, shrinking slowly back against that wall. Cut to the children, sunlight bathing their silhouettes as they are marched under armed guard across the playground to waiting trucks. The women are tramping across the bridge, clutching their bundles. One looks back. The men line up against the wall. They sing the anthem to the end. At that instant we hear shots as the picture cuts to the cemetery, the language to German, the music to Wagner. We see the burning wreckage of the school, broken items from homes, a sewing machine, a portrait, lying in the stream. Gothic script proclaims the sentence. And what you're looking at is a documentary photograph of the atrocity at Lidice on the day it was done. And the film says, all the male adults of the village have been shot, the women have been sent to concentration camp, the children have been handed over to the appropriate authorities. The buildings of the locality have been leveled to the ground and the name of the community has been obliterated. But a new caption tells us that is not the end of the story. And of course we know that it isn't. Silent Village is propaganda, but there's nothing governmental or even political about it. It does not preach a doctrine or attempt to persuade an audience to a cause or an action beyond democracy itself and to honour Lidice. If anything, it seeks to inform citizens about themselves. In other words, at the heart of Silent Village is a vision of popular culture, the culture of the people as a class, as Jennings puts it in Pandemonium, made by the people themselves. The likelihood of that culture being silenced by fascism is what motivates the passion for the ordinary within the film. The radically democratic step that Jennings takes from this threat is to show these same people taking the defence of their culture into their own hands, not delegating the use of violence to the state or bureaucratizing it in the army, as is usual in war movies, but exercising it directly as saboteurs and assassins, and organising it through associations like the Fed, which is the union which their own government, never mind that of the enemy, is known to have treated only recently as subversive and threatening to its authority. Jennings does not assume that viewers would be aware of the details of working-class Wales any more than that they would know much about Czechoslovakia. He expects an audience to see their own lives within those details, and so he's been at pains to get them right, letting some of the local peculiarities and difficulties of language, class, and nation poke through the idealized portrait of community and family life, in order to show that these things apply everywhere. The villages are convincing as Czech miners, and by extension suffering humanity at large, only because they are authentic about themselves. Hence, and challengingly for the legitimacy of state authority anywhere, the justification that the film offers for the use of violence by private individuals also applies everywhere. Jennings's vision of popular culture is not just broad, that is humanist, it is also deep. It speaks to everyone in society from top to toe, integrating the lives of ordinary people into the fate of nations. Others have commented on the extent to which wartime Britain really did achieve popular egalitarian national purpose in the 1940s, perhaps for the only time ever. And Jennings did it in other films too, notably in his much more famous Listen to Britain. But The Silent Village is unusual in making that popular source, the popular source of that unity, so clearly class-based and not metropolitan, even non-English. The result is more Shakespeare than socialism, perhaps. Jennings links the top of society with the bottom, national survival with workers' lives. The film lets ordinary people speak for themselves, but they get to speak about something which is much more important than their own conditions. There's not a word of the self-expression or identity politics that limits so much documentary about ordinary people, and there's not a whiff of the documentary tradition of the victim, despite the subject of this film. The Silent Village makes the people the protagonists of the most important drama in their people's century. Their actions can change history, their humanity can move the audience. Seeing this film, we know why we're Democrats and what is to be done, as Lenin once put it. Propaganda it may have been, but this great little film, Daily Express, was well received at the time by professional peers and the untutored public alike, even by the Americans. It was favorably reviewed in Time magazine and the New York Times. And by the way, the wonders of Google mean that you can now access those reviews, even though they were published in 1943. Time magazine said, for example, all it takes to make a screen fact as good as the best screen fiction is know-how. It was nominated for an Oscar as Best Documentary Feature for 1943, an Oscar that was won by another propaganda movie called Desert Victory. Jennings became a scion of film history, a favourite of scholars and filmmakers like Toby Miller, Lindsay Anderson, Richard Attenborough, Lord Putnam, Mike Leigh. We're all professed fans, although the films that people mention most are Listen to Britain, Fires Were Started, and Diary for Timothy. It's my mission in life to get Silent Village back up there with them. Many films boast that you can see the money on the screen. An extraordinary feature of this film is displacement. What you see on the screen is not the means of production. You see what Jennings himself called the means of vision. The Silent Village inherits Jennings's knowledge of and interest in high art, his views about industrialization and class, his leftism, his delight in cinema as an entertainment medium, even his role as a propagandist, heir to Goya and Your Country Needs You. But the film displaces it all. It's not even like Listen to Britain or London Can Take It. It's not about Britain but Czechoslovakia. It's not English but Welsh. Not about war but community. Not about enemies but us. Its characters are actors but they play themselves. The drama they narrate is about literacy, but it's also about issues much closer to home. Anyone in the know would understand what was being said by the Fed about the power of the union, by the teacher about the language, and by working community about how they've created their own culture. All of these matters are part of British politics, towards which the Welsh have justifiably ambivalent feelings. But Jennings displaces all of this to the common cause. There's a greater threat, which miners, as part of an international community, are fighting for independently. At the time, these gestures of displacement must have been what enabled Jennings to make the film. Now they're the undertow that gives it power and resilience, far beyond other examples of the genre. Okay. This is what makes The Silent Village worth watching generations later. It takes popular culture seriously, and it's still, I think, a good drama. Its real stars are the people in it. The Czechs and the people of Wales both still remember it, and each claims it as part of their own history. In Cumghyr, they delight in seeing their forebears and tell stories of their uncles and aunties who had to play dead in a cowshed for this charismatic Englishman. But in one respect, the silent village remains very contemporary. It is an early example of pro-am, or interactive co-production, co-creation in the making of movies, what now might be called consumer-created content. The skills and passions of the filmmaker are needed, of course, but they are at the service of a greater work, one which casts the consumer as actor rather than as behavior, and thereby turning the major mass medium of the time from a read-only format into a read and write means of communication for its own consumers to send a message of hope across the world. The result, in my view, is great collaborative art, imagining genuinely popular culture. So the message is, look on this work, Big Brother, and do better. That's it.